The $1 horse didn't run when it was finally free. It walked straight past the open field and stopped in front of a locked shed no one had touched in years. Ethan had just bought it hours ago, told it was dangerous, unpredictable, not worth keeping alive. But now, under the dim yard light, it refused to move away from that door. Not pulling, not panicking, just standing there, as if guarding something inside, or stopping him from finding out. By the time Ethan Hale reached the edge of the auction yard, the crowd had already thinned into clusters of men standing with their hands buried in their jacket pockets, watching for one last cheap bargain before the night turned colder. The wind moved low across the dirt, lifting bits of straw and old paper into the floodlights. Somewhere beyond the pens, a metal gate banged, then banged again, sharp enough to make a few heads turn, and then turn back. No one at a horse sale looked surprised for long. The animal in the ring did not look wild. It looked finished. Its coat had once been black, maybe, or dark bay, but now it was the color of ash after rain. The mane hung in dull ropes along a narrow neck. A pale scar crossed the bridge of its nose, not dramatic enough to tell a story, only stubborn enough to suggest one. It stood with its head too low, and its body held tight, as if every muscle had learned the cost of moving the wrong way at the wrong time. "Mean thing," somebody muttered near Ethan's shoulder. "Mean or broken," another man said. "Doesn't matter much now?" The auctioneer gave the horse a glance that lasted less than a second. He had the voice of a man who had sold tractors, mules, cows, wedding china, and probably his own sleep somewhere along the line. "Rejected gelding," he called. $1 opening bid, 111. Laughter moved through the crowd, but not loudly. It had the dry sound of people too tired to enjoy being cruel. Ethan stayed where he was, one boot hooked on the bottom rail. He had not come for a horse. He had come to look at a used hitch rig somebody claimed might fit his wagon axle. But the hitch rig was gone, and now he was standing in the smell of dust and manure, with overdue feed bills folded in his coat pocket, and a diesel pump back home that had started making a noise like a dying lawnmower. He did not need another problem. He especially did not need one with hooves. The horse lifted its head once, just enough for Ethan to see its eyes. That was what made him raise his hand. Not pity, not kindness. He would not have lied to himself that way. What he saw in the animal was something closer to refusal. A worn-out, cornered, last-ounce refusal to give the world the collapse it expected. Ethan knew that look. He had seen it in his own bathroom mirror for the better part of a year. $1, the auctioneer repeated. Ethan's hand rose before his mind quite joined it. The auctioneer pointed. Sold. A few men looked back at Ethan with the flat amusement reserved for strangers who made foolish purchases. One of them, broad through the belly and smelling faintly of tobacco and old coffee, gave a low whistle. "You just bought yourself a fence breaker." Ethan stepped down from the rail. "For $1, I guess I'll survive it." The man snorted. "That one don't run like normal horses. That's the trouble." Ethan signed the paper inside a cramped office where the clerk never looked at him twice. The receipt was thin and already curling at the edges. Under description, it said only, "Gelding, no guarantee." Under price, there was a single numeral that looked absurd on official paper. Outside, the horse stood where they had tied it after the sale, ears half back, watching everything without seeming to focus on anything. Up close, it was taller than Ethan expected, all angles and restraint. There was old mud dried along its legs and a rubbed patch near the chest where tack had worn too long against skin. Ethan reached for the lead rope slowly. The horse did not snap, rear, or pull away. It only shifted its weight and let out one long breath through its nose. "Easy," Ethan muttered, more out of habit than trust. He led the horse toward the trailer he had borrowed from his neighbor that afternoon for the hitch rig he never got. The parking lot lamps painted everything in hard yellow light. The trailer ramp rattled under the horse's first step. Ethan expected resistance. He expected the backward jerk, the whites of the eyes, the sideways scramble people called dangerous when they were afraid of being embarrassed in public. Instead, the horse went in. That unsettled him more than a fight would have. The drive back to the farm took 40 minutes along empty county roads lined with winter-bare trees and dark fields that stretched flat as old sheet metal. Ethan kept glancing in the side mirror, half waiting to see the trailer shudder with panic. But the animal remained a silent shape in the dark. At home, the yard lay still beneath a moon buried behind clouds. The farmhouse sat dark. The old barn leaned a little farther each year, and behind it, beyond the rusted water tank and the patch of dead weeds, stood the storage shed nobody had used in years, a narrow building with a warped door and one window boarded from the inside. Ethan dropped the ramp and led the horse down. Its hooves touched the dirt, and everything changed. The animal stopped so suddenly the rope burned across Ethan's glove. Its head came up, its whole body hardened, not in panic, but in a kind of alert stillness so complete it felt unnatural. Then, without warning, it turned away from the open pasture, away from the barn, away from freedom itself, and fixed its gaze on the old shed at the back of the property. Ethan followed that stare into the dark. The horse took one step toward the building, then another, and when Ethan tried to lead it anywhere else, it planted its feet as though the earth had closed around them. Ethan did not pull again right away. He stood there with the rope in his hand, watching the line of the horse's neck as it angled toward the shed. The wind had quieted, leaving the yard wrapped in a strange, hollow stillness. Even the usual night sounds, the distant hum of tires on the county road, the creak of loose tin, seemed to hold back, as if waiting. "Not that way," Ethan said, firmer this time. He tugged the rope. The horse did not rear. It did not jerk or panic. It simply refused. Every muscle locked into place, hooves pressed into the dirt with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any violent reaction. Ethan felt it through the rope. A decision, not a fear. He exhaled slowly, then changed direction, leading toward the barn instead. This time the horse followed. That was the first thing that unsettled him. The second came later. Over the next few days, Ethan settled into a routine built on necessity, not trust. Morning started before sunrise, breath visible in the cold air as he checked fences, hauled feed, and tried to keep the place running on less money than it demanded. The new horse, he hadn't named it, hadn't planned to, fit into the work with an ease that didn't match its reputation. It pulled the small wagon without balking. It stood still while he adjusted worn leather straps. It moved when asked, stopped when told, never once testing him in the ways men at the auction had promised. But every afternoon, as the light began to fade and the long shadows stretched across the yard, something shifted. The horse would turn, not toward the open field, not toward the barn, always toward the shed. The first time it happened in daylight, Ethan noticed the change in its posture before anything else. The ears angled forward, not loosely, but with a sharp focus. The body followed, step by step, slow but deliberate, as if drawn by something beyond habit. Ethan stepped in front of it. "Hey." The horse stopped. He moved to the side. It adjusted. He tried to lead it away. It resisted, not violently, not with fear, but with that same steady refusal that felt almost measured. "Nothing there," Ethan muttered, glancing at the shed. The building had been part of the property long before he took over. Old storage, his father used to call it. Tools, broken equipment, things too worn to use but too stubborn to throw away. Ethan hadn't opened it in years. There had never been a reason to. Now, standing there with the rope in his hand, he felt one. He stepped toward the shed. The horse moved faster than he expected. It didn't charge. It didn't lash out. It simply stepped between him and the door, placing its body squarely in his path, not close enough to strike, not far enough to ignore. Blocking him. Ethan frowned. "You serious?" He tried to step around. The horse shifted. Same distance, same angle, Same quiet certainty. He circled wider, testing it. Again it adjusted, keeping itself between him and the shed as if it had measured every step before taking it. A slow irritation built in his chest. You don't get to decide where I go. He tightened his grip on the rope and pulled harder. The horse held. No fight, no noise, just resistance that did not give. For a moment, Ethan considered pushing past it, forcing the issue the way he would with any stubborn animal. But something about the way it stood there, head level, breathing steady, eyes fixed not on him but on the space behind him, made him hesitate. This wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear either. It was something else, something he couldn't name, and that made him uncomfortable in a way he didn't like admitting. He let the rope slacken. The horse did not move forward. It stayed exactly where it was, as if waiting to see what he would do next. Ethan stepped back. Only then did the animal relax. Barely noticeable. Just a shift in weight. A soft exhale. The pattern repeated the next day. And the day after that, always the same. Work, obedience, quiet. Then the turn. Then the shed. Then the refusal. By the fourth evening, Ethan stopped pretending it was coincidence. He leaned against the fence rail, watching the horse stand a few yards from the shed, facing it in silence. The sky had gone a deep, dull gray, the kind that pressed low over the land and made everything feel closer than it should be. From the road, a pickup slowed, then rolled past. Ethan kept his eyes on the horse. "People said you were dangerous," he said under his breath. "Doesn't look like it." The horse flicked an ear, but didn't turn. It was watching the shed. Ethan followed its gaze again, really looking this time. The door hung slightly off its hinge, warped from years of weather. The window above it was boarded from the inside, the wood darkened with age. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Still, something about it felt wrong. Not in a way he could explain. Just enough to make him aware of it in a way he hadn't been before. He pushed himself off the fence. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what you're so set on." He started toward the shed again, slower this time. The horse stepped forward immediately. Not panicked, not aggressive, but faster than before. And when Ethan reached for the door, the animal shifted into place once more. Closer now, its body nearly brushing his arm. For the first time, Ethan felt it clearly. Not resistance, not fear, a warning. He stopped with his hand inches from the handle. The wind picked up again, low and steady, moving across the yard, in a way that made the boards of the shed creak softly against themselves. Ethan didn't pull the door open, not yet. Behind him, the horse let out a quiet breath, as if it had been holding it the entire time. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't try again. Ethan didn't mention the shed to anyone the next morning. He moved through his routine like always, checking the fence line, hauling water, measuring out feed with the same careful attention he gave to every expense these days. But the quiet had changed. It wasn't just the land anymore. It was him. He found himself watching the horse more than the work. By mid-morning, a neighbor's truck rolled up in a slow curve of dust. Old Mr. Calder climbed out, stiff in the knees, his coat hanging loose on a frame that had long since given up trying to fill it. He didn't come often, not unless something caught his attention. "Word travels," Calder said, leaning against the fence as if he had nowhere better to be. "Heard you bought that $1 horse." Ethan nodded once. Needed something that could pull. Calder looked past him toward the yard, eyes narrowing slightly. "That the one they were talking about?" The horse stood near the far edge of the pasture, head angled. Not grazing, not wandering. Watching. "The same," Ethan said. Calder spat into the dirt. "Folks said it turned on someone. Kid, I think. Spooked bad. Almost got himself trampled." He paused, then added, quieter. "Didn't sound right to me, but people don't like details. They like endings." Ethan folded his arms across the fence rail. What details? Calder didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted, not to the horse, but past it, toward the shed. His jaw tightened just enough for Ethan to notice. That building still standing? Calder asked, too casually. Ethan followed his line of sight. Hasn't moved. Calder let out a short breath through his nose. Funny thing about places like that. They don't change. People just stop looking. Ethan studied him. You know something about it? Calder pushed off the fence, brushing his hands together as if the conversation had run its course. I know enough to leave it alone. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Calder turned toward his truck, then hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder. If that horse is sticking close to it, might be worth asking why before you go forcing doors open. The engine started a moment later, and the truck pulled away, leaving Ethan alone with more questions than he'd had before. The rest of the day dragged in a way that made time feel heavier. Every task seemed to circle back to the same point, like something in his mind refused to move past it. By late afternoon, the sky had taken on that dull, muted color that came before a drop in temperature. The horse stood again near the shed, just as it had the days before, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of its breathing. Ethan walked toward it, not with the intention of leading it away this time, but to see. Up close, he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. The ground. The dirt around the shed wasn't evenly worn like the rest of the yard. It carried marks, old ones, faded into the surface, but still there if you looked long enough. Scuffed lines, compressed patches, as if something had happened there, over and over, until the earth remembered it even after everything else had forgotten. He crouched slightly, brushing his hand over the surface, dry, packed, disturbed in ways that didn't match ordinary use. Behind him the horse shifted. Ethan stood slowly. I'm not trying to start anything, he said, more to the air than the animal. He took a step toward the door. The horse moved instantly, closer this time than before, not just blocking, pressing in, its shoulder nearly against his chest, forcing him to step back to keep his balance. Ethan's jaw tightened. Enough! He pushed forward, not violently, but with intent. For the first time, the horse reacted differently. It didn't just hold its ground. It flinched, not away from him, but toward the door, as if something inside had triggered it. Its ears pinned back for a fraction of a second, then snapped forward again. Its breathing changed, faster, sharper. Ethan froze. That wasn't anger. That was fear. He stepped back on instinct. The horse didn't follow. It stayed where it was, body angled between him and the shed, but now there was something else in its stance. Something tighter, more urgent. Not just a barrier, a warning under pressure. Ethan looked at the door again. The wood was old, cracked along the edges, the handle rusted but intact. Nothing about it suggested anything worth guarding. No lock, no fresh marks, no sign of recent use. And yet, someone said you almost hurt a kid, Ethan said quietly, his eyes still on the shed. That true? The horse didn't react, but it didn't look away either. Ethan let out a solo breath. That's the story they tell, he went on, but nobody seems too interested in what actually happened. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell from the back of the property. Metal, dust, something older that didn't belong to the present. Ethan stepped back again, giving the horse space. It didn't relax. Not fully. It held its position like it expected him to try again. He didn't. Not this time. Instead, he turned away, walking back toward the house with a weight in his chest he couldn't quite name. Halfway there, he stopped. Something had clicked. Not a full thought, not yet, but enough to change the direction of it. If the horse had been labeled dangerous because of something that happened near this shed, and nobody would talk about it, then whatever the truth was, it hadn't been simple. Ethan looked back one more time. The horse stood in the same place, still watching the door like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to be the one to open it. The wind came in low that evening, dragging dust along the ground in thin, restless lines. By the time darkness settled, the temperature had dropped enough to bite through Ethan's jacket. He stood on the porch longer than he meant to, staring out at the yard, where shapes blurred into shadows and the shed stood like something set apart from everything else. He had tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself it didn't matter. But the horse hadn't stopped. All day it had hovered near the shed, more restless than before, its movements tighter, its attention sharper. By nightfall it had begun pacing, not far, not wildly, but in short, controlled steps that never strayed beyond a few yards from the door. Each turn ended in the same place. Watching. Waiting. Ethan stepped off the porch. The gravel crunched under his boots, loud in the stillness. The horse's head lifted immediately. Its ears snapped forward, its body aligning toward him with a focus that made his chest tighten. "Easy," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. He walked straight toward the shed. The horse moved faster this time. It didn't wait for him to get close. It closed the distance in a few long strides, placing itself in front of him before he reached the door. Not aggressive, not panicked, but closer than ever, so close he could feel the heat from its body through his coat. Ethan stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached past it. The horse reacted instantly, not with force, but with urgency. It pressed forward, shoulder brushing his arm, blocking the reach entirely. Its breathing came faster now, uneven in a way that hadn't been there before. Ethan pulled back. "You're going to wear yourself out over a piece of wood," he muttered, frustration creeping in. The horse didn't ease. It stood there, holding that same line, but something had changed. The steadiness from before had tightened into something closer to strain. Not just warning, desperation. Ethan looked at it carefully. The eyes were different up close. Not wild, not empty. There was something in them that hadn't been there at the auction. Something that only showed itself when he came near the shed. Fear. Not for itself. For something else. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards along the side of the building. One of them knocked sharply against the frame, and the horse flinched, not away from the sound, but toward the door, shifting its weight as if bracing against it. Ethan followed that movement. The door. He stepped forward again, slower this time. The horse didn't push him back. It stayed in front of him, trembling now, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough that he felt it through the air between them. Ethan lowered his voice. "What are you trying to keep out?" No answer came. Only the steady, strained breathing of the animal in front of him. Something inside Ethan shifted then. Not sudden, not sharp, but enough to break through the resistance he'd been holding on to. This wasn't about a stubborn animal. It hadn't been for a while. It was about whatever had been left behind. He moved to the side. Carefully. The horse adjusted, but slower this time. Its body still tried to block. But there was a hesitation in it now. Something caught between stopping him and not being able to anymore. Ethan stepped closer to the door. The wood creaked under his hand as he reached for the handle. It was colder than he expected, the metal rough against his palm. Behind him, the horse let out a low sound. Not loud, not sharp. Just enough to carry. Ethan paused. Then he pulled. The door resisted at first, stuck from years of weather and neglect. The hinge groaned as it shifted, the sound long and dragging through the quiet night. Dust shook loose from the frame, drifting into the air as the gap opened. The smell came first, old air, trapped, dry and stale, with something underneath it that hadn't seen daylight in years. Ethan pushed the door wider. The beam from the porch light barely reached inside, but it was enough to catch shapes. Tools, broken boards, a length of rope hanging from a nail frayed at the end, and the wall. There was a mark there. At first it looked like nothing. just a darkened patch where the wood had been worn unevenly. But as Ethan stepped inside, the angle changed and the shape came into focus. A dent. Not deep, but deliberate, as if something heavy had struck the wall with force. Below it, the floor told the rest of the story. Scuffed wood, dragged lines, a pattern that didn't belong to storage. Ethan's chest tightened. He turned slowly, taking in the space. The rope on the wall wasn't just hanging, it had been used, not recently, but not forgotten either. His mind moved before he could stop it, pulling pieces together from places he hadn't looked in years. The arguments, the nights he stayed in his room while voices carried through the walls. The one time everything went quiet, too fast. The ambulance, no explanation, just silence afterward. Ethan stepped back out of the shed. The horse stood exactly where he had left it. But it wasn't blocking the door anymore. It had shifted back a step, its body still angled toward the opening. But no longer in his way. Its breathing was still uneven, but the tightness in it had eased, just enough to notice. Ethan looked at it, really looked this time. "You weren't stopping me," he said slowly. The words felt strange in his mouth. "You were trying to keep me from doing it too late." The horse didn't move, but it didn't look away either. Ethan turned back towards the open door. The night pressed in around him, heavier now, carrying more than just the cold. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been an accident people forgot. It had been something they chose not to remember. And now, standing between the shed and the horse that had guarded it for years, Ethan understood one thing with absolute clarity. Opening that door wasn't the hard part. What came after? That was the part no one had been willing to face. Sleep didn't come that night. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on low, the kind of light that left corners in shadow. The papers he had pulled from the shed lay spread in front of him. Old receipts, folded notes, a report stamped with a date he recognized but had never questioned. He read it twice, then a third time. Each line stripped something away. It hadn't been the horse. That much was clear now. Years ago, a man had been hurt inside that shed, not by an animal, not by chance, but by a mistake, one that should have been admitted, explained, owned. Instead, it had been redirected, blamed on something easier, something that couldn't speak for itself, a horse. Ethan leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He stared at the wall, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing pieces of his childhood rearranging themselves into something he didn't recognize anymore. His father's silence. The way people in town had stopped bringing up a certain name. The way things had moved on without ever being settled. He let out a slow breath. "You knew," he muttered, though there was no one there to hear it. Outside, the wind had died completely. The quiet pressed in, heavy but not empty. By morning, the sky had cleared into a pale, cold blue. Frost clung to the fence rails, thin and brittle. Ethan stepped out with the papers folded once in his hand, his jacket unzipped despite the chill. The horse stood near the shed, not as close as before, but not far either. It turned its head when he approached, ears flicking forward, watching him in that same steady way. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he held up the papers slightly, as if the gesture meant anything. "It wasn't you," he said. The words came out quieter than he expected. The horse didn't react the way a person might. It didn't step closer or shift away. It simply stood there, breathing slow, its attention fixed on him. Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to the animal. "I guess you've been waiting a long time for someone to figure that out." He lowered his hand. The tension that had filled the space around the shed for days, maybe longer than that, longer than he could measure, had changed. Not gone exactly, but loosened. The horse turned its head slightly, glancing toward the open door behind him. It didn't move to block it. Ethan followed that look, then turned back. I'm not going to leave it like this, he said. The decision didn't feel like something he made in that moment. It felt like something that had already been set in motion the second he pulled the door open. He walked back toward the house. The drive into town took longer than usual, not because of the distance, but because of the weight he carried with him. Every mile stretched out, giving him time to reconsider, to find a reason to turn back. He didn't. The small office on the edge of town hadn't changed in years. Same cracked steps, same door that stuck halfway before opening fully. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and something older, like time itself had settled into the walls. The woman behind the desk looked up as he entered. She was older now than he remembered, but her eyes hadn't changed. Sharp. Careful. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan set the folded papers down in front of her. "I think you can." She glanced at them, then back at him. "What is this?" Something that should have been said a long time ago. She hesitated, then pulled the papers closer, unfolding them slowly. Ethan didn't sit. He stood there, hands at his sides, watching as her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, deliberate changes. Recognition, confusion, then something deeper. When she looked up again, her voice was quieter. "Where did you get these?" "From my place," he said. "From a shed that should have been emptied years ago." The silence that followed was different from the one at the farm. This one carried history. Ethan held her gaze. It wasn't what people said it was. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers rested on the edge of the paper, unmoving. After a moment, she nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Ethan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it," he said. "I just thought you should have the truth." She looked at him for a long time, as if weighing something that couldn't be measured. Then she folded the papers again, more carefully this time. "Some things don't change what happened," she said. "I know. But they change what we carry." Ethan nodded. "That's enough," he said. When he stepped back outside, the air felt sharper, clearer, not lighter, just honest. The drive home passed in a kind of quiet he hadn't felt in years. At the farm, the horse stood in the open, not near the shed, not guarding anything, just standing, head lifted slightly, watching the horizon. Ethan walked over and reached up, resting his hand against its neck. The warmth under his palm was steady. "You can let it go," he said. The horse shifted its weight, then lowered its head a fraction, as if something had finally eased. Ethan stepped back and looked toward the shed. The old sign nailed to the side of the pen caught his eye. Weathered wood, faded paint. Dangerous. He walked over, pried it loose from the post with a firm pull, and held it in his hands for a moment. Then he set it down against the fence. No replacement, no explanation. Just space where something untrue had been. Behind him, the horse moved, slow, unhurried, turning away from the shed for the first time since he had brought it home. Ethan watched it go, then looked back at the empty space where the sign had been. Nothing needed to be said. And for once, the silence didn't feel like something being hidden. It felt like something finally understood. Sometimes what we fear isn't danger. It's the truth we've avoided for too long. This story reminds us that judgment without understanding can bury both truth and innocence. Real strength is choosing to face what's uncomfortable and make it right. If this story stayed with you, there are more journeys ahead that might change the way you see the world.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts, won't you, Wes? And subscribe to Lion's Quiet Stories.